Welcome to the EX Podcast, where I talk with business leaders, authors, and disruptors on how the workplace is changing. This podcast brings a different lens to the conversation around HR transformation, company culture, and employee engagement. It offers a brand and customer experience perspective rather than a traditional HR perspective. Why? Because companies have to think of themselves as employment brands if they hope to attract and retain talents. It is time we put people first to rehumanize the workplace. Simply because leaders who don't care about the employees will eventually be surrounded by people who don't care about their business. Today's guest is Ben Gallagher, co-founder of B+A. Today with Ben, we talk about why so few companies have an identified leader responsible for culture. What are the elements that define culture? How to identify what makes a company's culture unique and special. What employees really care most about. How a leader gets people to be more honest with him or her. How a leader changes long-established habits that now feel out of date. And how a leader makes sure all new staff knows what's important about the company. Support for this podcast is brought to you by Life Guides. Life Guides is an innovative company that partners with organizations to help them better support their employee families for their big or small life challenges that usually impact their vitality, focus at work, and their overall well-being inside and outside of work. Life Guides created a platform to leverage three of the most valuable and untapped resources on the planet: life experience, human connection, and wisdom. The heartbeat of the company revolves around trained guides who are ready and available to give your employees the relief they need. Find out more at www.lifeguides.com. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Ben. And because it takes a good amount of time to produce this podcast, please make sure to review the podcast on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, or YouTube, as it will help promote the content. If you want me to speak at your next event, get some advice on your EX initiatives, or send me feedback and suggestions for future topics and guests, you can reach me at svincent@exsummits.com or on Twitter at @EX_summits. All right, let's get to it. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the EX podcast. Today's guest is Ben Gallagher, and Ben is calling from Portland, Oregon, and he's the co-founder of B+A. Ben, thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Stefan. Great to meet you. Thanks for having me.
What is your background, and what does B+A do?
So my background's quite varied. I began my career as a journalist, and I worked for a number of independent television companies, particularly in news and current affairs. After that, I started working in advertising as a strategy and consumer insight specialist. And following that experience, I then transitioned to work for a brand, and I worked at Nike in the UK and also for the Nike Foundation, which at the time was Nike's corporate foundation working largely in sub-Saharan Africa. And then I set up B+A with my co-founder, Andrew Missingham, about 5 years ago. And in many ways, it's a business that's drawn on my experiences throughout my career. And I think the way that I think about B+A is essentially we are a creative management consultancy. So we work with clients to help them solve business problems, but using creative tools and creative techniques in a way that helps us unlock new perspectives and new ideas. And the way that we structure our work is we think about solving or answering three questions that our clients ask themselves. The first question is, what is going on in the world around us? And so so that work is very often about research, consumer understanding, understanding changing cultural trends or market dynamics in almost any country around the world. The second question that our clients ask is, where do we go next? Which is very much about strategy. It's about visions and missions and new plans and new ideas that are going to take them into new territories. And then the final question that they ask themselves is, how do we get the best from our people? Which is really all about organizational culture and how organizations can be excellent employers whilst also delivering on their goals, their strategic ambitions, maintaining the essence of who they are as an organization, but at the same time, charting an exciting course into the future. And I think, lastly, the thread that runs through all of our work is this idea of us being a human behaviour business, a business that's really about understanding human behaviour out in the world and equally internally within organizations. We help our clients understand that behaviour and then shape it in a way that helps them to achieve their objectives.
Fewer than 40% of companies have a leader responsible for culture, and even few know how to foster strong and healthy cultures. Now that you work a lot with companies around the culture and leadership, what are your thoughts on this?
Firstly, I think that it's a bit of a tragedy that the statistic is so low. I think that culture has been perceived to be something within organizations that is soft and perhaps not as important as the hard metrics. What we're learning, or what organizations are realizing and waking up to, is that in fact culture is very often the glue that binds teams of people together and is the secret ingredient that helps them to not just succeed during the good times, but actually to kind of survive through the difficult times. And I think that up until recently, people didn't really appreciate the value of culture, and hence why there hasn't been a particular emphasis placed on it. In more recent times, with the ability to work independently, the kind of growth of the kind of entrepreneurial economy globally, big businesses especially are realizing that they've got to compete for their employees in a way that they never used to. And so people are leaving and setting up their own businesses. They're leaving to go to smaller companies. And so suddenly people are asking the question, why is that happening? And often it's because of the culture of an employer, of the business. So I think that people are realizing that it's important, but of course there hasn't been a lot of study into what makes workplace culture succeed. And so it's a kind of, I think it's still an emerging space, which is really exciting. But there's a lot of work to do to help businesses and organizations at large kind of work out how to do it really well.
Let's talk about the culture and then your definition of culture. What are, in your opinion, the elements that define the culture?
So the way that we think about culture, firstly, is that culture is, in many ways, as I mentioned, the glue that binds teams of people together. Mm-hmm. And that culture can manifest in lots and lots of different ways. And in fact, it does manifest in lots of ways. And culture is kind of granular. It's made up of many, many, many small things that when you pile them all up together, a little bit like sand in a sand dune, they have a certain shape. And of course, they're always slightly evolving and slightly moving. And that may not be explicitly visible at any given moment, but just like a sand dune, it's always changing in the wind. The way that we think about culture is that it's made up of kind of 7 or 8 kind of key elements, if you like. The first one is the people in an organization. What is the nature of the people that exist within this organization? What kinds of people are they? That's a really big factor in shaping the culture. The second one is process. What kinds of processes exist within an organization, and how does that shape how people behave? Is it very rigid? Is it very loose? Is it are the processes hierarchical or not, or do they allow people freedom? The third element is pace. Is this an organization that works furiously until late in the night at the last minute? Is it somewhere that's very well planned and methodical and timely? Does it jump between those two things? What kind of scale of pace does it best operate in? The fourth is power. Where does the power really exist within an organization? Is it with the leadership? Is it in the ambition of the organization? Is it in the past in terms of something that they may have achieved and long to achieve again? Is it in the mythology of the history of the company or organization? So what is the kind of centrifugal force, if you like? Where does the power really lie? The next one, number 5, is kind of perspective or perception. Why do people think they're coming to work? Is it aligned with what the founders or the leaders of the organization believe should be the reason they're coming to work? And what is motivating them to show up and do their best work? The 6th one is place, and that is about the environment that they work within, and how the physical environment allows them to function equally, not just in one place, but are they distributed around the world, across time zones, and how does that affect the cadence and the ability for people to work kind of formally and informally together, and not just work, but also build relationships with each other. And then finally, the last 2 are protocol. So protocol is really about the unwritten rules in an organization, the things that aren't written in the handbook, that you learn as you spend time there, that are often really kind of part of the mythology of the place. And that might be about certain kinds of people and what you can ask them for. It might be about certain codes or behaviors that exist that everybody just does. And you kind of wish that you knew about them when you first started, but of course they take time to realize. And then the final one, unfortunately, I haven't been able to think of a word beginning with P, but essentially it's remuneration. And remuneration and the terms on which people are remunerated is incredibly important, because understandably so, it's a really big driver for behavior. And often with clients, we strongly counsel them that if they want to create a behavior change or a cultural change within their organization, they have to think about the kind of structural or almost systematic changes they have to make, and that goes right through to how they reward people for the work that they're doing, because it's an incredibly powerful motivator. So that's how we think about culture, by looking at it from all of those different angles. In many ways, a bit like a mixing desk, and every organization has their own mixing desk, and different levels of elements of their culture are stronger or softer. And the question is first, well, where are we now? And then secondly, where do we want to be, and what levels do we have to turn up or down, or turn off, or turn on entirely, in order to be the kind of organization, to foster the kind of culture that we're hoping.
Let's dive a bit deeper then. Once you identify those 7 elements, or 8, that define the culture, how can a leader identify what makes the culture special and different from another company's culture?
I think so once you've done that piece of work and you've kind of understood the where you are on those 7 elements, I think that then, of course, it's about understanding where you are within the context of your market, within the context of the broader culture that you might be operating in. And that's where you really start to be able to say, okay, well, what is it that's unique about us in contrast or alongside others? For example, at B+A, we talk about ourselves as a creative management consultancy. Now, in many ways, we are therefore a management consultancy. I would argue that our culture is very different to many of our competitors. But we have only been able to really recognize that by looking at ourselves against our competitors there. We understand what our culture is all about, and we understand where we need to improve it or evolve it, and equally what to retain. But it's when we actually then look across the market, we get a really helpful sense of how that might differentiate us with others. Now, of course, I don't think that you should spend all your time comparing yourself to others. You have to be really unequivocally confident in who you are as an organisation as well. And I find a helpful way to do that is to think about what your vision or your ambition is, and then to ask yourself the question, is this the kind of culture that's going to allow us to achieve that vision? So, for example, if you set yourself a very bold vision, and then you look at your culture and you realise that, in fact, there's a lot of fear within it, or people aren't confident enough to give new ideas, you have to ask yourself the question, well, are we able to fulfill that vision? What do we need to do to either change our culture or to be more realistic with our vision in terms of what's possible?
How do you change the mentality and the mindset in an organization where you may have a brand new, very aggressive and bold goal, but a very risk-averse or change-averse culture? How do you change the mindset to embrace that new challenge and make sure that everybody in the organization is going to follow through?
I think there's a couple of things to think about. The first one is that essentially what you're talking about is behaviour change. How are you going to elicit changes in behaviour amongst your employees or your team? And when you look at behaviour change, there's been much work on behaviour change in a social change context, whether it's stopping people smoking, whether it's encouraging people to adopt something new, a new policy, or whatever it may be. And for us, there's a number of different things that are really important. The first one is the new goal has to feel more hopeful and optimistic and exciting than the present reality. So it cannot feel like a pain or a burden or a chore. It has to be exciting, and it has to be emotionally exciting to people. They have to want to move towards that goal. The second thing is, I think it's really important for people to feel a sense of ownership of that goal. How do they see their role in achieving that goal? How is that clear to them? And in many ways, what are the breadcrumbs towards achieving that, so that they can feel like they're making progress towards that goal, and it doesn't feel so big and so out of reach that they don't know whether or not they're making any progress towards it. And then equally, what are the smallest, fastest changes that you can make to create that sense of change towards the new goal? We often at B+A run an exercise called paper cuts. And paper cuts are our way of thinking about positive possible changes. And we work with teams to define their terms for what a paper cut might be. So, for example, it might be, it needs to be something that can happen within a week, and that it doesn't need sign-off by leadership. And so people define paper cuts that are going to help enact the vision. And then they work towards fixing as many of those paper cuts as they possibly can as quickly as possible. And it's a really neat technique for how they can start to feel the change is positive and is possible, and that they have a sense of ownership over it. So I think that there's some kind of behaviour change is very, very useful in terms of how you shift a culture towards a new big ambition. The second thing that I think is really important, and again, this is a structure that we use a lot in our work, is this idea of starting first and foremost by recognizing the people around you and their value and building strong bonds between those people in order for them then to collectively feel like they can get after the vision. So, for example, if we run workshops or offsites where we are helping people to unite around a new ambition or even create the new ambition in the first place, the structure that we will use is that one is see the individual, be the individual. That's about recognizing who you are as people, as humans, at your best and your worst, being very open about that. The second stage is then unite the team, and that's about saying, okay, well, if this is who we are as people, what do we look like together as one? Where are our strengths? Where are our weaknesses or areas to work on? Where do we have gaps? Where are we particularly excited about this collective possibility? And then the third stage is face the challenge together. And that's, okay, how are we, as this collection of individuals who are now together, going to get after this new vision or new ambition? And really what that process is about is helping people to feel like they've got to go after something together with each other as people, as humans. And through that process, they've shared and exposed who they really are as people and built kind of deeper relationships and so therefore a deeper commitment to each other to get after a new ambition. Very often, I think people start with step 3, face the challenge together or get after the goal together. And the risk is that you don't do the work building the relationships in the right way to make the goal then feel possible, the vision feel possible.
You're talking about being people-centric, and maybe with the risk of stereotyping, what do employees care the most about?
I think that if we're going to be really honest, employees or people care about, firstly, what they're being paid.
Mm-hmm.
They care about what their progression looks like. They care about how they're being valued by their employer, and then how they're perceived by the people around them. And I think that it's naive to think that remuneration in whatever form is not critically important. That's the system and we live within, and so I think it's important to pay that, due attention. Now, it's not everything, but it is really, really important. And then I think progression is equally important. How am I learning? How am I evolving? How am I, going up the ladder, so to speak, or progressing on the journey that I've defined for myself? And then, that third element, how they valued, how are they feeling recognized or valued by the people that work for them? And then equally, the people that employ them, and then finally, kind of how are they feeling valued by the people around them, their teammates and colleagues. Now, different people have different levels of priority against those elements, but I would argue that the pay thing is very important for people, quite understandably so.
Now, there are some studies that show that, especially with the younger generations, Gen Y or Gen Z, they're willing to take maybe a lower salary if the purpose resonates with them very deeply. Mm-hmm. Do you see this as well, or is it just like a made-up idea?
No, we do see it as well, but I think that you have to also recognize that they're at a stage in their life where that's possible. So they absolutely value employers that have values aligned to their own, and we have seen people make decisions about where they want to work based on, in large part based upon that. Now they're at a stage in their life where they're able to perhaps sacrifice or make sacrifices on other elements for that to be possible. But I would argue that as you progress along your career and your responsibilities and your bills mount up, that becomes a harder decision to make. I'm not saying that people don't as they progress on, but it becomes a harder decision to make. I think that, and it's fantastic. It's fantastic that younger generations are challenging their employers to hold, certain value sets. I think it's really, really exciting. But I do think that they're at a stage in their lives where it's possible for them to do that,
From an organizational perspective, talking about growth planning, when you consider that people switch jobs every 3, 4, 5 years, it's really hard for organizations to come up with a career plan or a growth plan, knowing that their employees may leave, pretty soon. How do companies that you work with approach this dilemma between growth planning and knowing that tenure might not be like a driver for many of the employees?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I think that it slightly depends on the size of the organization. For much bigger companies, they're able to offer potentially lots of different kinds of experiences that help an employee to feel like they're having change, even though they're staying being employed by the same company. So movement between departments, being given stretch assignments or new areas of focus, perhaps even geographic moves as well, are all things that can help somebody to feel revitalized and refreshed and get new challenges and new experiences whilst remaining a part of that same business. Yeah. I think for small to medium-sized businesses, it is a real challenge. And I think that for me, one of the keys to it is for the employer to adopt a mindset of being a learning organization and a platform for learning for their employees. So how can you help to stimulate your employees' opportunities to learn and develop in as broad a ways as possible that work for them as a person, not just an employee? So that may be about being able to offer them the opportunity to study alongside their work. It may be about the opportunity to enable them to run a side hustle business, alongside their work. It may be about the opportunity for them to, step into a new kind of leadership position in a small business where they take on new responsibility. As a company that works largely on a project basis, it's a real challenge for us to be able to judge, firstly, how long, the appetite for people is to stay with us, but then equally how we manage the capacity within our business to serve our clients, really well. And we found that just by adopting thinking about B+A as a learning organization has really helped us, not just a kind of functional delivery organization.
How does a leader get people to be more honest with him or with her?
That's a really good question. The first thing is, I think that you have to, as a leader, be willing to put your own vulnerabilities out into the room and onto the table, and to help people to see that you as a leader are not somebody who gets it right all the time, and that you have your own fears and concerns, things that you find hard, and that ability to be vulnerable in front of your teams is really, really important. I think then the second thing that's really important is for your people to understand the boundaries of your responsibility for them. And so, for example, if you're in a small or medium-sized business, often leaders find themselves as the people who pay the salaries, who do the annual appraisals, who are the friendly colleague in the office. They're kind of playing every role. And that, I think, can be really hard for employees then to really be able to be honest, because they've got concerns about, well, if I'm really honest, does this affect, is this maybe going to affect how I'm paid, or is this maybe going to affect my career, or whatever it is. So thinking about, if you were a leadership team, thinking about the different areas of responsibility that you might have for the management of everybody in the business, I think it can be really helpful. But more than anything, as a leader, being able to demonstrate and be comfortable being vulnerable yourself, and being willing to put yourself out there is really, really important, and can help people to feel comfortable then being open and honest themselves. And of course, if they are open and honest, then being able to, as a leader, to accept that and to be able to process it and respond to it in an appropriate way. Because, of course, if you respond inappropriately, take it too personally or whatever it may be, then you've undermined the trust that somebody's just put in you.
Yeah.
And I think that's particularly important. How you receive the feedback and then act upon it is absolutely critical.
Speaking about change, how does a leader change long-established habits that now feel out of date?
I think that you have to get the team to recognize the situation themselves. I don't think that it can happen by the leader pointing at the problem and saying, look, this needs to change. You need to be able to get people to recognize that something needs changing themselves. And so that is about kind of processes of reflection. It's about being able to create the context for people to be really honest amongst themselves as a group, and not feel nervous that they're going to either get criticized or kind of shouted down or ignored. Long-established habits take time to change as well, and I think it's really important to remember that we often get asked to work on kind of 3 or 4 day offsites, and the clients hope that the change will all occur in those 3 or 4 days, and I don't believe that's the case, unfortunately. Change takes time, and change is a backwards and forwards process. If you for example, if you were to take something like smoking, it's quite unusual that a heavy smoker will give up smoking one night and that will be it. There will be moments of lapsing back and then having to kind of get back on the program, and you have to be willing to accept that you sometimes, to move forward, you have to take a few steps back too. I think you can also think about the behaviours that need to change, that are deeply entrenched. Through what are they manifesting themselves? Are they manifesting themselves in particular through certain people? And therefore, what might you have to do about those people? Are they manifesting themselves through the environment that you're working in, or other behaviours that might exist? And as a result of any of those things, can you be quite specific about what might need to change to unlock? So it may be that there is a person or a group of people that might need to be moved out or moved on, or change a role, or given the opportunity to change themselves. Or equally, it might be about the memories of something needing to be reframed, so that people don't feel stuck in the past, for example.
And I believe that if you explain what impact it can have on their individual performance as well as overall business outcomes, it can help better define what the framework is around expected behavior change, and at least you can also track what are the results.
Yes, exactly right. Being able to build kind of change plans for people, and of course, as we talked about earlier, positioning those in a positive, optimistic context of moving forward towards something exciting is really, really important. I think that convincing people to change their behavior towards the promise of something new and exciting as opposed to away from a problem is more compelling. We've developed a kind of personal development plans for clients that look at different stages of development around identified areas of kind of identified behaviors that are necessary for the business to succeed and therefore that the teams of people have to fulfill. So we call it an equalizer, and essentially, for example, you may have 10 behaviors that you need employees to really fulfill in order to succeed and help the business succeed. And across those 10 behaviors, there are likely 5 or 6 levels of attainment, from beginning, very early stages in terms of achieving that behavior, right through to being the best in the world at that behavior. And as you progress on that journey, the number of steps within each level increases, because as you get better at something, you realize that there's only ever more to learn. And the thing that we found with the equalizer that's really helpful is you can't be brilliant at everything. There are going to be areas that you're particularly good at and areas that are not your strongest suit. And the tool really helps people to recognize where they are really strong, equally where they might need to work on something, but be comfortable with that. And so when we think about creating individual kind of change plans, we often do that within the context of an equalizer, where they can see that it's okay that not everything has to be the best, but in fact they have areas that are their stronger suits and areas that they need to continue to work on, and that's okay. Because the pressure to be kind of brilliant at everything is too great for people to be able to deal with. And then, of course, they struggle to do that, and you don't get the best from them, and they don't embrace the change that you're asking for.
Before we conclude our conversation today, let me ask you some fun questions.
Okay.
So you're from the UK. Which part of the UK are you from?
I grew up in Nottingham. And then I lived in London for about 15 years before moving to the US.
Is there anything that you miss from the UK?
Yeah. I miss Marmite, which is a kind of salty breakfast spread that you can put on your toast in the morning. In Australia they eat Vegemite, and in England we eat Marmite. And I also miss the pub as well.
Ah, yeah, the pub. Yeah.
Yeah.
Are you a soccer fan?
I'm actually a rugby fan more than a soccer fan.
A rugby fan, okay.
Yeah, which perhaps you appreciate being French.
Yeah, probably not so much rugby in Oregon, are they?
No, there isn't much rugby in Oregon, sadly.
What is the one thing that irritates you about the US?
I think that the thing that I've noticed about America and the US that has been a really big part of the culture here and has shaped the cultural mindset here is that the belief in one's ability to create your own destiny and create your own success and create your own luck, or not luck, but your own future. And that's very compelling and very powerful in many ways. The people I meet here, especially in a business context, have real ambition, real kind of hustle. They want to make stuff happen, and I think that's very appealing. However, what I have noticed is that the challenge with it is that the flip side is that there isn't really a safety net for people, and that it's very easy to fall through the cracks here. because the social structures aren't really set up to support people who might need it. And I think it is a big difference from Europe, whereby there is a more of a social safety net that I think was created after World War II in many countries in Europe, and that doesn't exist in the US. And for example, universal free healthcare at the point of access, or whatever it might be, are things that I think, if they could be made a reality here in the US, it would be really, really exciting. But that's me dipping my English toes into American politics. I'm not sure now is the time to do it.
You've got a very interesting background, as we discussed earlier. What profession other than your own would you like to attempt that you haven't done yet?
I'd love to be a musician, and the reason is that I'm really terrible at singing and playing musical instruments. So if I could find somebody who could teach me how to sing and how to play musical instruments, I think I would really, really enjoy it. But I might be a lost cause, unfortunately. What
is your favorite vacation spot?
My favorite vacation spot?
Yes.
I have a couple of favorite vacation spots. I really love the southwest coast of Ireland. So County Cork, West Cork in particular. There are a number of small villages around Castle Townsend that I think are really, really beautiful. Very peaceful. It's a little bit like stepping back in time. Everything happens at a slightly slower pace. But the landscape and scenery is stunning. And at the same time, I have a real soft spot for the Swiss Alps. As a kid growing up, I was lucky enough to spend many years going to a small village called Les Diablerets in French-speaking Switzerland. And it was somewhere where in the winter you could be in the snow, and in the summer you were, walking and riding your bikes and being out in the fresh air. And so I love the mountains. To be honest, I'm a big fan of traveling, and so I have the opportunity to travel with work a lot, and I'm always trying to add an extra couple of days onto my trip to be able to go and explore a little bit. And over the years, I've been lucky enough to work a lot in Sub-Saharan Africa in a number of different countries, and so
nice.
I do really enjoy spending time out there as well when I can.
Nice. What is the way for our listeners to follow you and B+A on social media?
So you can subscribe to our newsletter, which you can find at beandaequals.com on our website. We write our bulletin newsletter once a week, every Wednesday, and it's written by members of the team. Gives you a little bit of an update of what we're up to and the things that we're discovering on our travels around the world. You can follow us on Instagram at beandaequals, and you can find us on LinkedIn as B+A. But I would say the bulletin's your best bet. You'll get the most interesting stuff through the bulletin. Sure.
Awesome. Any last word of advice or wisdom for our listeners?
No, I don't think so. I suppose that what I talk to a lot about to our clients about is, and this is actually the words of wisdom from a colleague of mine, Tamika, who's been with us from the very beginning at B+A. And Tamika often kind of boils it down to the fact that at the end of the day, the world is run by people. And so if you're trying to solve a business or cultural or social challenge, you have to boil it down to the people. And you have to understand the people involved in the situation. And if you can do that, and you can do that with empathy, then I think you've got a great chance of being able to build a really, really strong culture. And it won't be easy, but if you commit to it, then it can be really, really fruitful in the good times and absolutely critical during the more challenging times.
Very nice thoughts. Well, thank you, Ben. It's been a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for tuning in to the EX Podcast. If you want to learn more, visit our website at expodcast.com. If you want to find out more about our next conferences, go to exsummit.com. Finally, you can also find my manifesto on business to employee or B2E branding at b2ebranding.co. See you next week.